Hi everybody. Liesl and I have just finished spending a morning and afternoon shouting at our children to finish school.
So we can do this video.
We feel very qualified to come and bring you all of the advice about successful homeschooling. In all seriousness, we had a session at the staff retreat in America that was focused on homeschooling and just how to get started, how to continue on, what to do about high school. And when we actually narrowed it down to what the people, the families in our organization are looking for right now, it seems like you guys are looking for advice on how to get started. You either have young children who are not yet of school age, or they're just coming on the cusp of that school age and you're like, I'm launching to the field, I'm starting an assignment, I'm fundraising, what in the world do I do with these children? So in this video, I think we've decided that we're going to have a series to be able to answer questions as well as we can, not being full experts on homeschool, but just people with, Liesl, 2 decades of experience and me with a decade of experience homeschooling, and try to answer the questions that we can to be helpful to you. So today is going to be focused on how to get started, and we're going to address those of you who have concerns about preschool and grade school, or what we would call beginning formal education. So Liesl has a degree in early childhood development education and has been my mentor through this whole process. And something that we're careful of is that we're going to sound very similar because we have done similar things with our children's schooling. We have schooled them together at various points. That doesn't nullify what other people are saying about the way that they're schooling their children or the curriculums that they're using. However, we do want to present a very important point when it comes to this early childhood thing and this getting started that we would humbly submit is actually correct. And then from there, you choose your curriculum and you name what matters about your kids' schooling and you go from there. But we want to present to you a very important childhood development aspect of starting school that we believe is important. So saying that, Liesl, you've posted a file which is actually very helpful. It's on the Homeschool site. If you search under files on Facebook, on that group, you'll see it, that assesses and gives information about early childhood and what's important about their education during those years. Well, first of all, what would we say are the early childhood years, the preschool years?
Yeah, so early childhood years would be 3, 4, 5-year-olds, and it has a completely different goal set than that of formal schooling. So it must look different than your usual like grade 1 through 12 program. It has to, because it has different goals. So unfortunately, for some reason, most homeschool curriculums actually, it seems like, have never consulted early childhood development persons to help them write their curriculums. And so there's actually very few, in my humble opinion, that are developmentally appropriate for preschoolers. And that's basically why we're doing this, because you as a parent who don't necessarily have like a teaching degree under your belt, you're going to trust the curriculum. And we're here to tell you that many of those curriculums really do not consider the goals of early childhood development. They only consider the goal of academic development, and there are so many more goals. So
I was just going to say that if you refer to a link that I just recently posted on the OM Homeschool page, you'll see that there's that question, and this was the primary question that I received from our moms at our staff retreat was, can you post like a developmental chart about how do I know if my child is behind or ahead, or how do I know that they're ready for schooling, ready for kindergarten was a big question. And I posted a link from a woman called The Busy Toddler on Instagram, and she makes a list of kindergarten readiness, and it surprises you because it's actually very little, if anything, to do with academics. So Liesl's going to name those other important things besides academics.
Yeah, so we have, what in early childhood development, we have 8 domains of learning. So one is cognitive academic development. Another one is fine motor skills. So actually for a child, even just to be able to learn to write, they need to develop their fine motor skills. And it needs to be not with what they're gonna write with. And so like an example for that would be playing with pegs or playing with very small things to develop their little fine motor control means little muscles. There's gross motor development. So kids need to run around, they need to climb trees, they need to throw balls around. Language development is a big thing. So read stories together, teach them songs, teach them poems. Social emotional development is a big one.
Especially in varying levels of isolation
Yes.
and cultural adjustment and all of that.
Yes. And that doesn't always mean, because if we grew up in a traditional setting of you only socialized with your peers, social development doesn't only mean that the kids, everybody actually have to learn to interact with various ages, not just their own age group, but that's a big one. And then the self-help and adaptive development. So like, how do you wipe your butt when you've been on the loo? And how do you bath yourself? And how do you just do things for yourself that your mom shouldn't do for you your whole life? And then the last one is spiritual and moral development. So as you can see, the cognitive development, which is usually what your traditional homeschool curriculums focus on, is one very little part of the whole big picture. And for some reason, this is what parents feel anxious about. They're like, well, is my kid going to be ready for school? Like, should they learn their numbers when they're 3 years old? But early childhood development teachers, even in the USA, because for a long time I thought maybe that's just a South African thing, but it's worldwide. People agree on this, that it's so much more. We have to focus in the early childhood years. We have to focus on way more in developing the kids than just cognitive or academic development.
And I think where that sometimes gets confusing is Liesl assessed a very trusted curriculum, and one that we recommend and is highly used in the ministry, which is Abeka, and she assessed their preschool program. When she assessed their preschool program, you realize very quickly it was not authored by early childhood developers. It was really just a preschool program. It was really like, let me teach you the very basics of what you're going to start to learn in kindergarten. And that's really inappropriate. They don't need to be doing worksheets at 4 years old. They don't need to be doing pre-reading or the kind of things that you are assessing as pre-reading because of maybe the way that you were raised, or the things that you see that your friends' children are doing because they're in a public school daycare. Not to be harsh on anybody, but it's just not necessary. They have all of this wonderful opportunity to play, to interact, to be multicultural, to learn a second language, to have social development outside of their peer group. Our primary focus should not be whether they can read by the time they're 4. When I see things like teach your baby to read, I'm like, why would a baby need to know how to read? That's not necessary. We don't get any gold stars for them being able to say the Pledge of Allegiance by the time they're 3. That's just not how it works. And what you will find is when people have focused excessively on that academic side, then there's very often social and emotional things, or fine or gross motor things that have gone missing and that are not being focused on. And so we're not trying to scare you by any means. We're actually trying to say, stay away from computer programs and curriculums and worksheets and workbooks before they're of formal school age. And we would call that 3, 4, and 5. We're going to talk later about when to start kindergarten. So saying that, kind of giving that example, then we get into preschool. So should we even be doing preschool, or should they just run wild until they're 6 years old?
So as I've said, there are these 8 domains of learning, right? So these are the goals for preschool years. And many of them, like for example, the language development, like, yes, you actually have to speak to your child for their language to develop. You actually have to read them stories, read them books. It's not just going to happen by accident. So should we be intentional with preschool education? Yes, I believe we should. But it doesn't have to look like baby formal schooling.
And I want to say, this is coming from somebody who ran a preschool. So as Liesl is encouraging us to not do workbooks, to not, have formal education when they're of those preschool years. She also ran a preschool, so she was doing intentional activities with them, more Montessori style activities, all the way through those years. So it's very intentional development and pouring into them in all of those domains of learning, but not necessarily, working with a pencil and a workbook at that age. And so we are by no means saying that you should have no structure for your preschool child. And that's where we kind of get into parenting, which we don't want to do today. But, in your household, there has to be a structure. There has to be a function in your household. There has to be a routine. And that can be in every area of your life. That doesn't matter if you're in language school right now, if you're fundraising, if you are full-time in a sector, if you're leading expeditions, whatever you're doing, there has to be some structure in your household. There has to be some time when you are focusing and pouring in to the children. And that actually gets more challenging as they get older in many ways. We feel like the most challenging parts of parenthood are the baby and toddler stages, but many times, we're kind of just adapting to them in that stage. As they get older, our time gets more and more intentional with them. And so we would encourage you to spend intentional time with your preschool age child. They don't run your schedule. It's not that they get to, you have 4 hours of Montessori programming with your 3-year-old, so you can't participate in the workday. That's not what we're saying. But there are some programs that would help you to get creative ideas and to bring some structure to your day, some activity to your day, that would also be good for not just the cognitive development of your preschooler, but that social and emotional development, that fine motor and gross motor, because it's just as important that they are able to listen to an activity being presented to them and participate in it appropriately as it is for them to learn their ABCs. It's just as important for them to be given an instruction and follow through with that instruction, and to know how to paint on a paper and not on the table. And I don't know if you can think of any other examples that are really good for those preschool years. Like, it's important for them to be able to share toys. It's important for them to be able to play together without fighting.
And my mind's actually wondering, as you're speaking, I'm thinking most of us, when we think back to our childhood years, we remember that we were in school from 8 in the morning till, for me, it was until 2. I believe American schools go even later. And that's the picture you have of preschool, and that's also not what we're saying. So some structured activity would be like 1 to 2 hours 3 times a week. And also remember that what I've learned is that you can actually gauge attention span by kids' ages. So if your child is 3 years old, their attention span's probably going to be between 3 to 5 minutes. So don't read a story for an hour long and get frustrated when they don't want to listen.
But it is appropriate to expect a 3-minute attention span.
Yes, it is appropriate, and So, and they need to develop that. Of course, this is also a skill required of society, right? That there are so many instances where you actually have to be able to focus, receive instruction, and act upon it.
So in no means by discouraging you from using workbooks in these preschool years are we discouraging you from being intentional with your children, from structuring some activities for them and with them, from pouring into them from a moral perspective, from growing them in their fine and gross motor skills, all of those things. And if you look at the file that Liesl posted on the Homeschool page, you will see pretty much a full assessment of many of the popular preschool programs available right now. And just read through those and do some research and see what would be appropriate for you to use during those years. And you use them quite loosely. And some of you might ask the question of, I don't feel equipped as a teacher. I don't have any experience here. This is not my strength. I don't know what to actually do. And Liesl and I were just talking about this before we came to record this video. And as much as we have a lot of compassion for those of you who may feel that way, I want to encourage you that you are the best teacher for your child because of the Holy Spirit who has granted you the stewardship of that child. And if you don't feel totally confident, now's a good time to practice. There's very little to lose here in these preschool years. Just your intentional love and development and support of them is enough. And if you don't feel totally confident because these curriculums don't have a script to follow, that's okay. This is not, anything that's going to be make or break. We encourage you to practice some of your creativity in these years. So some of the curriculums that we would recommend that are actually age appropriate for these preschool years, 3, 4, 5, are curriculums like the Playing Preschool, A Year of Playing Skillfully, Timberdoodle, ABC Jesus Loves Me. Those are all listed and linked in that file you can go and look at. And would just encourage you to assess for yourself what you think would be an appropriate curriculum for you to use. We would encourage you to stay away from the really intense Becca preschool. Sorry to throw Becca under the bus. Sunlight Preschool is also an option. They have a decent program as well. To stay away from excessive use of things like Khan Academy, computer programs. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head. Just other curriculums. I've seen Horizons has a preschool program that is not age appropriate. Go with a preschool program, not with a grade school curriculum that has added on a preschool program.
And I think if you know what the 8 domains or the goals of early childhood is, then it's actually easy to see, oh wait, this curriculum is going to require my kid to sit down and do worksheets. They're not going to get all these other developmental things through this. So that's why we're talking about this, right? So that if you understand these are the goals of early childhood development, then it's actually easier for you to see when you're looking at curriculum, okay, this is appropriate, this maybe not.
And we're
so
trying
much.
to lift a burden from you,
Yes.
because we don't want to add a burden. What you're thinking is, oh my gosh, I was planning to do this, and now that's all thrown out the window. The level of misery that it will be to try to get 85% of 3-year-olds to work on a workbook will be relieved when we tell you you don't have to do that. Some of you, a few of you, will have 3-year-olds that will love to work at a workbook. Even more reason to stick them in a mud puddle, right? If they would naturally choose the workbook. But most of you will have 3 and 4-year-olds that are not very interested in sitting still and sitting at a table and working with a workbook. And so we want to relieve that pressure for you and move you more towards, cognitive development that focuses on all of the 8 domains. And these curriculums, which we've recommended, will do that. They've already done that research for you. They're by early childhood educators. So I think that kind of wraps up what we think about 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. A couple of hours, a few times a week. And using an age-appropriate curriculum. And I think now what we move to, and not really worrying about, well, if they don't know their ABCs, or they don't know their numbers, or they don't, have this memorized or that memorized. I think there's a caveat of, if you are truly concerned about the development of your child, we would encourage you to reach out. You can reach out to us. You can reach out to someone that you know in your home country. You can find some resources online. My mother-in-law is a special education teacher. She would be happy to speak to you about the assessment of your child from a developmental perspective. If you're concerned about them in those early childhood years, their language isn't developing, their social skills aren't developing, then that's a whole other issue. But for most of us, we're able to see, this child is within the range of normal, but they're not interested in coloring on a paper. That's okay. So moving on from that, I think the question is, so when do we start formal education? Because at some point we have to start formal education.
Yeah, so formal education should start in kindergarten, which is usually between the ages of 5 and 6. And then the foundational years, that, well, we can talk about that in a little bit, but between 5 and 7 years, which 7 would be on the late side,
and
5 on the early
side.
But yeah, that's when formal education starts.
So formal education, which we would define by learning, letter recognition, sound blending and reading, and number permanence. Some of those are education terms that you might be like, I don't even know what that means. But basically what we're saying is math and reading. That's what we would define by a formal education, beginning in kindergarten and progressing through 1st grade, and kind of assessing for yourself where your child falls in that age range. In America, you would typically start kindergarten the year that they turn 5, and that starts in September. In Africa and most other places of the world where it's a year-round school, you start them the year they turn 6, and that starts
the year they turn 6,
but it starts in January. So it can get a little confusing, and depending on your country that you're in and the state that you're coming from or the country that you're coming from. What we're saying is you have to assess it yourself. Some people have very young 5-year-olds, some people have more ready for school 5-year-olds, and we would say 5 is young and 7 is old.
And
so
I just want to add in there, and this is like maybe a little bit technical, so just so it's said, don't worry too much about it, but there are skills that kids actually need to master before they can learn to read. So they need to be able to cross their middle line. They need to be able for their eyes to cross the middle line. Their eyes need to be able to move from left to right. So you will actually, like Jessie said, we want to relieve a pressure off of you. You actually have the option as a homeschooler to not push your child into this mold where they have to start, for example, learning to read when they're not ready. It is okay to wait a little bit. And it is immature. Sometimes it's literally just a maturity thing. For example, I'm sure you all know that boys take longer to mature than girls. But if they don't have the skills that they actually need, the preschool skills to learn how to read, they will struggle to learn how to read. And you could just wait 6 months and that struggle will be over. So we may post, I'll look into it, but we may post even a school readiness list. Like these are the skills that you need for reading and math and whatever. And so that if your child's not ready yet, don't push it, because then you're actually doing more harm than good.
And you can always start and then say, they're not ready for this.
Yes, it's okay to start and stop.
Or take them through one book and say, we're going to go through this book again because this was actually too hard. And I think that's what people have a really hard time assessing is, how do I know if they are ready? And what is the difference between the pushback that most of us get from our kids regarding school? And that's really, it's a tricky question. The reality is that's a tricky question. We're always assessing the difference between behavioral issues and cognitive issues and motivation issues. But I think at the end of the day, you can feel safe in knowing that if you're starting some letter and number recognition by about 5.5 or 6, that you're within probably a fairly normal range. And if you see no development, if you're really seeing a really hard time with letter recognition and number permanence by the time they're 7, then that's a great time to reach out and have some further assessment and have some help, or any time that you feel like you need more help with that thing. But everybody has an adjustment to school, kids included, moms, dads, kids included, everybody adjusts to school. So I think, Liesl, what are we talking about once again when we say formal education? Say we've assessed that our child is about 5.5 or 6 and they're moving towards that formal education, and then what? What do we do from there?
I don't know that I know what you're asking. We choose a curriculum.
I think so. I think that's what a lot of people are struggling with. It's like, what curriculum do they choose? Where to go from the time that their child is ready for school, what to do now. And I think this is where we come to a very personal assessment of yourself. People are always looking for the best curriculum for their child. And the reality is it's not going to be the best for your child if it's not a good fit for you because you're the teacher. And I was just saying to Liesl before we came, like, I might really like the look of a size 4 pair of jeans, but if they don't fit me, they're not a good choice for me. And that's the reality with curriculum, is it doesn't actually matter what is the best or worst curriculum on the market. If it's not something you're going to use and feel comfortable with, then it's not a good fit for you. And so I think to make an assessment, and this is the conversation that we had at the staff retreat. Well, I'm just going to interview you, actually. I'm going to say, I'm going to ask you some questions about what would be a good curriculum that would be a good fit for you. So let me ask you, Liesl, and ask you, who are going to be different from Liesl, do you prefer freedom in your schedule, or do you prefer a routine-based schedule?
I prefer routine-based.
Okay, and there's going to be plenty of people out there who are going to say, actually, I am freedom all the way. I need the choice. I need to have the choice to be able to, choose one day a week that I'm gonna head off and do something else completely. How much autonomy do you have over your time? Meaning, how much do you say what happens with your time?
So I have a lot of autonomy. I can decide what I want to do with my time. And
that affects the kind of curriculum that you choose, because you may be in a situation where you actually don't have a lot of autonomy over your time. You have somebody, coming in, and maybe you have Maybe you have, like Jamie Freeman, young twins who are making demands. You don't have a lot of set time all in a row. Maybe you have your job in the ministry, like Rochelle or Bev is very dependent on you being available. And so you don't have a lot of time autonomy. And that would depend on the curriculum that you choose. How consistent of a person are you? This is a good question.
I'm the nerd of homeschooling.
Yeah. So you're very consistent.
I'm very consistent.
And the thing is I tend to be a very consistent person too. It's okay if you're not. Yes, homeschool does require a level of consistency. So does parenting. But if you are somebody who is just not naturally super consistent, you need to pick a curriculum with a little more freedom, because the very consistent, scripted out, box ticking curriculum is going to drive you crazy. So you need to know that about yourself. Don't pick the strictest curriculum if you're the most, freewheeling person in terms of a scale of consistency. Here's a good question. Is your ministry about accessibility or availability? And I'll explain what I mean by that. When I say accessible, it means, do you need to be interruptible all the time? Are people coming into your office, coming into your house? You are managing a base, or you are managing an office and you have to run out and deal with things all the time? Or is it more about availability? I would say my schedule is a little bit more about availability. I can schedule the meetings that I want to have. I can schedule the events that I need to partake in. So I do tend to get fairly consistent hours of the day where I can focus on school.
And I'm the same.
I know Bev has started homeschooling Addie this year, where I was doing her schooling before, and something that she deals with is the fact that she's in the office and she has to be very accessible to people. And so she doesn't necessarily have 4 or 5 hours of her day where everything else is silenced and she's focusing on school. And she had to choose a curriculum that was appropriate to that. Whereas because I have the opportunity to need to do school in a chunk where I can participate in it, and then I need to be free after that, then I have chosen a curriculum that suits me towards that. And we're going to recommend some curriculums, but you need to know that about yourself before you get started, especially, your ministry job, what that's going to entail, how many hours a day you're going to have, if they're going to be hours that you can be actively teaching the kids, or you need to be observing them and just providing help, where you can.
And then there's the thing about, I obviously study teaching. I'm very passionate about it. I want to teach my children for hours every day. You may not feel that way. So you may feel like, okay, I just actually want to be a facilitator. I don't want to sit with my child for 7 hours every day and do school with him. And then I chose Sunlight because I get to teach my children. If you don't want to do that, then don't choose Sunlight, because that will be required.
If you want to be more of an observer and more of a helper, then you would choose something that would do the teaching for you, like the video version of Rebecca. The teacher is teaching. There is no way as a homeschooler that you're going to get out of participation.
And that's a good point, because I think if you don't feel that passionate or confident about teaching your children, you're actually looking for that curriculum that will teach your children for you, and that's not going to happen. And actually, if you are going to choose homeschool, that should not happen. There will be a time commitment, and there should be a time commitment.
Yeah, so it doesn't actually matter which curriculum you choose. You are going to be involved. It's just the difference of whether you're going to answer questions about the science lesson that has been taught on the video or in the book, or whether you're going to be the one actually presenting the science lesson. And that's a personal preference as well, and that sometimes comes down to your kids' personal preference too, especially as they get older, which we'll talk about in another video. I was actually surprised when I was studying to have this discussion at the staff retreat. When I looked up the different styles of homeschooling, all the curriculums that are popular within this ministry, all are contained within one category, which is school at home. None of us are doing anything that different. That's the reality. Is you can go on and on about the benefits of Sunlight versus Becca versus ACE versus anything the whole day long. They're all actually very similar, and it comes down to our personal preference and affordability and accessibility and what works for us. So let us encourage you that teaching grade school is done in such a cyclical way, such a circular learning way.
which means the same concepts get repeated every few years.
Over and over and
Yeah.
over. And I will find there are days where, no kidding, Sunda is learning the same lesson in language arts in 10th grade that Kaya is learning in 7th grade, that Noah is learning in 4th grade. A very similar thing about the use of apostrophes or something
Yeah.
like that. It doesn't stop. And so you don't have to be so anxious if you're using a trusted curriculum that you're going to miss something.
Yeah.
The reality is that we would encourage people to use a trusted curriculum simply so that it doesn't have to be stressful for you.
Yeah.
So you don't have to be so concerned about, am I missing something? You have a job to do as well that is outside of nurturing your family, and that's the ministry. And so the likelihood is that you don't have 2 hours a day to plan out
Yeah.
lessons. If you have that freedom and you love it, that's fine, take it. But we're encouraging you to use trusted curriculums that are doing a lot of the work for you. And it presents another question, which is that deciding on curriculum, which is how much accountability do you need?
Yeah.
And some people need more accountability than others.
Yeah, and it's also with the trusted curriculum and the accountability, it is very easy that if you're homeschooling and you're like, this language art, we're talking from experience,
Yeah.
okay? This language arts is dumb. And then you end up not doing language arts, for the entire year. But a trusted curriculum will actually make sure all the holes are filled and give you the accountability of all the aspects of what your child needs to know academically is included in the curriculum.
Yeah. I think something that is very, very important when choosing a curriculum for your child, and really for just walking into schooling, because we've just said a lot of the curriculums are very similar, is you need to name what matters about your child's schooling experience. Some of you may not know that answer for your family yet, but it's very important that you know what matters to you about what your children know, and whether it's very important to you for them to have an excellent math education, or a really excellent high literature-based education, or you really want to concentrate on STEM learning, which is science and technology. There are different things that you're going to feel passionate about as a person and as a family, and then you might choose curriculums that are more focused on that. I know for me, it was very important for my children to be culturally literate. Very important for them to be able to be geographically literate, to know where things were on the map, to know what languages were spoken in those countries, to know what foods were served in that countries, what the people were like, what the religions of that country was like. So that was an easy choice for me to choose Sunlight, because that curriculum focuses very heavy on that. Have I experienced the consequences of that in some ways? Yes, because there are things about Sunlight that are not perfect and that we've had to adapt to in later years. However, I would still choose it because of that aspect again. There are those, the most common choices, or there are those who have chosen Abeka because it is a very high level, stringent, academic, very trusted program. And there's nothing wrong with that. You will end up, most likely, them getting a very good education with that program. And yet you might miss out on other things that would have been maybe a more creative aspect or a more independent or critical thinking aspect of another curriculum. You just have to choose what matters for you and for your family. And I think never overestimate the wisdom and experience you have. As much as you know through the Holy Spirit what you need for your child, reach out and ask people who have been doing it. Don't just assume I'm sure, I student taught, I have an education degree. I have been 100% mentored by Liesel when I started school. She literally wrote down what books to buy, because I think we all need help and assistance in that way, and a good foundation.
Yeah, and can I just then offer my services? I really feel very passionate about preschool and early childhood development. This is why I studied that degree. And so, I would feel very happy to help people choose curriculum, think through how to do this. Ask me questions, even with beginning to read, because those are we talked about that, but those are the critical years. So KA first, I would say up to maybe second or third. Those are the foundational years that thinking of, for example, reading. It is the skill that you're going to use your whole entire life. So don't make that the year that you're gonna go on 10,000 trips.
That's so true.
And you know, that is the year. Those are the years that you need to stay home, stick with it. You know, be accountable, all those things, because it's foundational. Those are foundational.
It is very true.
years.
That's a reality check too, to remember that every year that you have a child learning to read, you're going to have to read with that child every day. That it doesn't matter if you are on vacation or you are on, you know, a trip, or you're doing ministry. Like, consistency is so important in those early years. And I know that there are going to be those of you in the ministry who missed that out, who missed out that information. You're like, yep, that's what happened to me. And we had major reading issues. And so the important thing about that early formal education is consistency. It's reading and math as the foundational things that are going to provide you for a good education for the future. And regardless of what curriculum you choose, those things have to be accomplished, and that's just all there is to it. So I wanted to talk a little bit. I want you to know that because I'm not neither of us are super experienced with other curriculums other than the ones we've chosen, and besides asking questions of you that are using it and kind of doing a little bit of research, I spoke to Joy Wickman, who is a teacher and has run a school, and she's a part of our ministry, and she's based in the U.S., and she is happy to be a resource for any of you. And I'm gonna post her WhatsApp on the Facebook group so that you have access to her, or you can get a hold of me and I can get you in contact with her. But she gave me some information that we want to lay out for you very clearly in terms of the different very popular curriculum choices. Something that's important to know about Abeka is that it's highly structured, it's very trusted, and there's an accountability process. You can accredit Abeka, and what that means is you can treat it like it is a school that your child is actually attending, and they can get a grade report at the end that you send in and they accredit. How important would you say is accreditation for those early years?
Well,
not preschool, but formal education years.
Yeah. So caveat, I'm not American. I have two kids actually in college right now. The accreditation no one asked me, honestly, that's the honest answer. No one asked me what I was doing with my kids until 8th grade when I enrolled them in American high school, online high school. So accreditation isn't that super important for the early years. It does get very important in the high school years, because then that influences college, your GPA, all those things that you know more about than I do.
Well, we would encourage you to become accredited, to choose an accredited curriculum or online program by the time that they're in high school. But for these early years, feel free to follow the state guidelines that are available to you by your state or by the country that you're from. The reality is that it's however much accountability you need. We know somebody right now, not a part of Overland, who is doing Abeka for her kids and who is doing the accredited process. It's extra work and it's extra money, but she felt like she needed the accountability because she knew that if she had that, she would actually do it and finish it. If you're somebody who needs that, then that may be honestly, if you're somebody who needs that much structure, Abeka may not be the best choice for you because you might lose your mind. But if you're somebody who needs accountability, then that's fine. So Abeka offers that. So does Bob Jones. But highly structured, trusted, and accountable would be Abeka. Highly structured, trusted, and accountable would also be ACE or the PACES program. However, very important distinction that I want you to hear about Abeka. It is at a very high level. Sometimes people are like, well, that's great, right? I want my kid to get the best education possible. Comes back to that pair of jeans. Yep, a size 4 pair of jeans is a great pair of jeans if it fits me. If it doesn't fit me, then it's not a great pair of jeans. And so if Abeka is a good choice because your child is at a high level, academics is very easy for them, they love to do school, then that may be a very good choice. But you need to know that they're at least a grade level above most other curriculums.
Which then you can also feel very free if your child is officially in 3rd grade, but they're doing 2nd grade Rebecca, don't feel guilty
That's
about stuff like that.
probably more appropriate,
Yes,
actually.
exactly.
Yeah. And otherwise, you'll drive yourself crazy trying to push kids into an above level grade. This is not about whether they're learning or not. It's like you're actually pushing them past their development. And so would just encourage you to be aware of that. If you choose to put your 1st grader in 1st grade Rebecca, know that according to most teachers in America, they're working at a 2nd grade level. So good to know. ACE, on the other hand, is actually at a lower level.
Yeah.
So it's also trusted and accountable, but Joy would say that if they are in 2nd grade and they're working with a 2nd grade ACE program, it's more like a 1st grade curriculum in other places. ACE has been very, very good for kids, especially learning to read. I know a lot of kids who've learned to read very effectively from ACE. I don't have anything against it, but it is at a lower level. Then it's less difficult and less involved than other curriculums. Another highly structured and trusted curriculum, but is slightly more flexible, would be Bob Jones. There are those in the organization that use Bob Jones. Can think of a few families that also offers the accredited option. I don't have much more to say about that. Seems to be pretty on level, pretty on grade level,
And
true
then I
to
think
grade.
both of those have video options,
Yes,
right?
both
So that if
Rebecca
you don't
and Bob
want to
Jones have a
teach your
video
children,
option.
they can do that.
Yep. And then we would say a medium structure curriculum that would be more creative but higher involvement would be curriculums like Sunlight and My Father's World. Kelly posted a video about My Father's World. They're very similar curriculums. They are more literature based, more history, science, cultural literacy based. Nothing bad about it. You know, it has its good and bad points, but it is high involvement. You are going to spend a lot of time reading aloud, teaching lessons to your children. And so that is something to just be aware of with those 2 curriculums. We've chosen to only offer up about 5 curriculums today. There's a million out there. And here's a question I think I have for you, and maybe Riesel, maybe this is a good question for you. Are you somebody that would rather want to be told what to do, or you would rather do the research on your own and come up with a plan?
That's like, it's a little unfair to ask me because I am the teacher that loves teaching. So I actually did the research based on science or based on what I know. So when I chose, I actually did the research and chose for myself. So I didn't want to be told because I already knew what I wanted and what my goals were. So,
and I think for me, I wanted to be told.
Yeah.
It was like there was enough going on in the world when it came time for Sunda to go into formal education, and I wanted to be told. And so I came and said to Liesel, tell me how to start. And she literally wrote out for me. Now, I've diverted from that sometimes. I've, said, I don't really like this thing, so I'm going to go this way. We've diverted from each other, but it was helpful for me to be told.
Yeah.
What I find is that there's a lot of people who want to do their own research.
So I want to say something about that. Of course, I'm the person who did the research, so I'm not saying that's wrong. This is a concern for me. When there is a curriculum that was written by one person who has never, they don't even have an education degree, to me that's big red flags. So we actually looked at a curriculum like that.
It was called, just so you know, it's called Gather Round Preschool. Gather Round Homeschool. Something like
whatever. I can't remember. I'm glad you can. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
It's beautiful. And that's about it. So I'm not going to go to, I don't know, Jake Schwertfeger for medical advice. Why not? Because he's not trained medically. So in the same vein, why would I want to get a homeschool program that's not been written, or what's the word I'm looking for?
Just developed
by people who knows about it, which is why I'm also passionate about choosing the right preschool program, because it does seem to be the tendency for homeschool programs to not
have a variety of contributors.
Yes.
And people who have the education to do it.
Yeah.
And we're not saying that, those things are necessarily terrible. It requires more accountability. It requires more research on your part to make sure you're not missing something out that could be important. So I actually brought that Gather Round Homeschool to Liesl and said, this is so beautiful. This looks like could be an option for our people. Will you look at it? And she looked just a level deeper than I had and said, yeah, but it's written by one woman who doesn't necessarily have, like an education in these areas. So it's not that it's bad or wrong. It's just that you might consider that when you're looking. And that's why I would say, don't get overwhelmed by all the options out there. There's a few other things. I know certain people have used The Good and the Beautiful and, other curriculums that are popular. There's nothing wrong with those curriculums. But you can go on and on and on. You could search to the end of days. Yeah. You could add things to your homeschool to the end of days. The reality of what you need is that something that's going to be effective for your child and for you, and it's going to allow you to participate in ministry and do something other than homeschool with your days.
Yeah, and let me then just add, if you are like looking at other curriculums, of course you're free to do that. Maybe it would be a good idea to contact Joy or like I would be willing to, or whoever,
to look at it.
To look at it and say, yeah, this is good, like you're covering all your bases, or maybe supplemented with this and that.
I think the most important thing in wrapping up this session is, most of us have been raised in the system. Most of us, there's plenty of us who were homeschooled, which is wonderful, but most of us have been raised in a private or public school system, and we kind of have that feeling that that's the right thing. Homeschool isn't going to look like that. Your life already doesn't look like the way that you were raised, most likely. And so there's a really helpful thing, I think, is just the same as when you walk into ministry, when you walk into marriage, when you walk into a team, you drop your expectations. You just walk in, not with low expectations, but just with no expectations. And you just go in and kind of go with the flow of how it's going to work out. And we're available to you. There are other mothers on the team. I know Courtney Kerpachek also has an early childhood education, and she is currently assessing preschool programs, and she's willing to be a resource for people who are assessing preschool programs as well, and just give advice towards that, and maybe give advice towards specific activities and things that have worked for her as she is still in those years and we're kind of past those years. So there are people who are available to you. Reach out and ask questions, and try not to get overwhelmed. In saying that, there are people who get overwhelmed and freeze.
Yes.
Don't freeze. There are people who get overwhelmed, and because they feel like they can't make the best choice, then they freeze and they can't move forward. It is an important time in their life. It is important that you focus in those 3, 4, 5 years on some intentional activity. It is important that you bring them into a formal education. And the reason why we're not coming on and encouraging, total unschool, total child-led schooling is because we don't ever want them to be restricted from doing what they're dreaming in their hearts to do because of their parents' call to the mission field, because they haven't necessarily had a traditional education. I think that would be both of our goals and the goal of the ministry as a whole. When we sit together with Sharon and Rochelle and talk about what are the goals of our homeschooling in our ministry, and it would be that our children would never be limited, that they would have any option that they would want to take, whether that's a 4-year university that leads to grad school and a doctoral thesis, or whether that's a trade school, or whether that's going into the ministry full-time, or whatever it is, that we want to support that in our kids. And in that way, we should give them the highest quality of education that is possible for us to give them, in our circumstances. So I hope that this has answered a few questions for you. We would love to field some questions, maybe that would be beneficial for everybody. And so if there are things that we didn't cover, when this is posted, the link, feel free to comment on the Facebook thread and say, these are some things you didn't cover that I'm still feeling confused about regarding this particular topic. Not older kids, but preschool age children and starting out in education. And just hope that it's been a helpful thing for you.
So we are going to do more videos. One will be on how to actually assess that your kid's doing okay and not falling behind and all of that. And another will probably look into high school, and then based on your questions, we may, come up with more. But there will be more videos just for this
not all of you needed this much guidance,
Yeah.
but there are those of you who
This is
do.
almost an hour gone.
And so-
Can you believe it?
And so, yeah, hope it's helpful to those of you who needed it. And we just bless you on your homeschool journey. Want to be resources to you and excited for you to invest in your kids. The Lord will bless you in it. Bye.
Amen.